Welcome everyone. The title of our action research project is The Impact of Mnemonic Techniques to Increase Vocabulary. The purpose of this action research project is to examine the implementation of mnemonic techniques, in this case, the mnemonics memory palace technique, as tools to increase university students' vocabulary to improve their English level in oral performance. The rationale of this research project are to implement the mnemonic techniques as meaningful vocabulary learning strategies, to investigate the impact of mnemonic techniques during a student's vocabulary learning process, and to identify the increase of vocabulary while building up effective semantic networks for long-term retention. The research questions for this action research project are two. The first one is, to what extent does vocabulary increase while the mnemonics memory palace technique is implemented? And what is the meaningful impact that students experience while using the technique? This action research project introduces the definitions of different terms in the literature review, such as definition of vocabulary, vocabulary learning strategies, bizarreness and the imagery multiprocess model, as well as the explanation of memory, mnemonic technique or device, and the mnemonics memory palace technique. The importance of understanding the meaning of these concepts can help the research to distinguish how these elements have outstanding roles in vocabulary learning. Because of the lack of time, I will focus on the main definitions for this research. Let's start with the definition of memory. Memory plays an important role in vocabulary learning. According to Bartz and Gage 2010, memory can be defined as a lasting representation that is reflected in thought, experience, or behavior, and learning is the acquisition of such representations. It is well known that human memory has limits, but impressive capacities. For example, most students would like to have a better memory, by which we mean a capacity to store and recall information. However, there are two phenomena which are big challenges for our language learners. The quickly forgotten, when they want to transform the material from it to the never forgotten. So that memory researchers suggest, in order to ensure that material moves into permanent long-term memory, some principles or techniques based on word learning. The definition of mnemonic technique or device. Belexa in 1981 stated that the experience over the centuries has shown how mnemonic devices have been effective to memorize, so that it is remarkable that they are not used today. Later, Belexa in 1987 mentioned that mnemonic devices represent a form of unnatural learning. For that reason, studying these devices, our understanding of human learning and the operation of human memory become fundamental. According to Miller, 1956, aside in Belexa in 1987, there are two main types of mnemonic devices, organizational and encoding mnemonics, which reflect the two main activities of human memory, unitizing and symbolizing. Mnemonics memory palace. According to midterm in 2016, a memory palace technique is used to store and memorize information that needs to be remembered in a certain sequence by using rooms, houses, buildings, palaces, or simply places that the learners know as storage rooms for the information that they wish to memorize. Midterm states that the simplest form of a memory palace is a room, because rooms can be used to make up your imagination by pegging information into them. A peg can be a location, an object, or furniture that exists in a room of the memory palace.
Methodology. This study was carried out as an action research in order to evaluate the impact of mnemonic techniques to increase vocabulary, provided by the teacher researcher in 10 weeks during the semester. Both qualitative and quantitative approaches were required to obtain and show results. Action research, I'm going to explain the concept of McKay in 2006, that she mentions that action research is a productive and feasible method because many teachers agree it can involve an investigation of their own classroom and is directly related to their classroom problems and concerns. Next, I'm going to explain the context. This action research was carried out in an A2 English group of the four-year Bachelor of Arts in Languages program from a private university in Veracruz. In this program, 80 students took an A2 English course as part of their discipline studies, which lasted 16 weeks. This English course was completed during the second semester of their degree, and it is one of the linked subjects, such English first and English third. Next, the participants. The participants of this action research were 8 students whose Spanish is their native tongue. 6 out of the 8 participants were female. At the moment when the action research took place, a student's age range was between 18 and 20 years old, and all participants were in the second semester of their degree. They had been past English first course in the first semester. Pseudonyms were used to protect participants' anonymity. Once the purpose and procedure of this action research had been explained, all students agreed to participate in the implementation by signing a confidentiality agreement to assure their anonymity while participating in the data collection. All participants completed interviews, tests, and journals, which function as data collection instruments. Before implementation, learners took a pretest or a diagnostic test to know how many words they recognized. The scores obtained were not positive enough. And according to these results, 6 out of 8 participants failed the diagnostic test. They could not recall the majority of words obtained in the previous English course. They did not store and did not recall new vocabulary. Taking into consideration these previous findings, an action plan was designed to increase vocabulary by implementing the use of the mnemonics memory palace technique. As a result, after applying it and practicing it, students were evaluated in vocabulary recalling by using free vocabulary tests every 3 weeks. 4 days later, a standardized open-ended pre-interview was applied for collecting students' answers to know how they learned new vocabulary during their previous English learning experience. The activity lasted 3 days. 3 students answered the question each day, 2 students the last one, to complete the 8 interviews. The first implementation session took half an hour to explain the technique for the first time. Later, how to put it into practice in the classroom by giving examples. And finally, to remember how to train it at home later. The vocabulary lists were taken from Units 1 to 3 from American Headway 1 textbook. Specify vocabulary lists or word banks that every student had to learn and understand at the end of the 6-monthly course. The students were tested next week's session. The first test from Unit 1 was taken on the 2nd week of implementation. The second test from Unit 2 on the 5th week of implementation, and the third test from Unit 3 on the 10th week of implementation. After training the mnemonic technique in class, participants' assignment was to practice the technique at home. Students were explained that they needed to memorize the path and the furniture in order to peg each word to each item going a clockwise direction at home. And according to Midterm 2016, the participants had to create a funny or bizarre image that could help them to memorize the whole word list in a short period of time. And to support this idea, McDaniel and Einstein in 1986 found that at delayed retention, the data are less clear, but they appear to show that bizarre images are better recalled than common images. And finally, the triangulation. 3 instruments were part of the triangulation to support the effectiveness and trustworthiness of the study. The standardized open-ended interview was the first instrument to collect students' data before and after implementation, to know English learning styles, and to know about their mnemonics memory palace technique experience. The vocabulary test was the second instrument to be used before and during implementation, as a diagnostic test and as a vocabulary test. And finally, the journal was the third instrument that students carried out during the whole implementation process to write the word list, the sentences, the bizarre ideas, and to draw the memory palace map showing the keywords pegged on objects of each room. After this implementation, we found 4 categories that I'm going to mention. The data analysis resulted in 4 categories. The first one, the correlation between imagination and memorization. Number 2, students' perception of the technique. Number 3, the mnemonic technique of the words. And finally, the advantage of the technique in vocabulary learning.
The first category shows the correlation between imagination and memorization. In this category, as it has been mentioned before, shows the importance of the using of creative imagination to recall new words. The students were asked to spend from 10 to 30 minutes in an average 2 or 3 times per week. Their imagination improved vocabulary recalling, as it can be seen in the examples. I imagine that my shelves are sometimes hot. As it was stated before, the use of creative, funny, or bizarre sentences help students to store and recall vocabulary. This is the conclusion that we have in the first category. The second category, which is students' perceptions of the technique, it shows that the technique was easy for the students to understand and perform. As a result, as they felt comfortable using it, they got good results. The technique was easy to understand and perform, and then the student said, I think it is easy and extremely useful because it helped me a lot while memorizing. The third technique, which is mnemonic technique and words, shows that the proper use of the technique eases the storage of a wide variety of words. However, in some cases, the connections that the students made was not easy for them or didn't facilitate the memorization of the words, because the idea of using the technique is to use imagination or bizarre sentences, but sometimes the bizarre connections that they made didn't help for the recalling of the words. For example, in some cases, students found it very difficult to remember the words they had connected. For example, the verb leave plus T, or the noun father plus toilet. But on the other hand, when they created other connections that were fun, but had more relation, for example, grandma and bookshelf, it was easy for them to recall the words later, and not only for the exam, but for future memory tests. Then the fourth category is the advantage of the technique in vocabulary learning. In this category, what we show as a result is the increase of oral production, because as they remember or as they recalled vocabulary, it was easier for them to produce. They were more fluent because they were having good oral production. However, the idea of memorizing words was only in vocabulary improvement, but not in grammar. As it can be seen here, in the oral production decreased whether the previous vocabulary learned was exposed to the change of tense. In other words, the students learned or memorized the words, but they were not very focused on the memorization of grammar or the use of tenses. So that could be an advantage of the technique only in vocabulary, but not in grammar. Then, as conclusions, we have that the mnemonic palace technique that was implemented engaged students because they felt comfortable using the activities. And then, as a result, they store and recall the vocabulary that they had to. The constant repetition of the mnemonic memory palace technique helps students to memorize words easily in a short period of time, 10 weeks, due to a more vivid experience. As we mentioned, the examples were meaningful for them. Teachers should suggest to create or determine strategies that demand more cognitive effort in order to reach higher understanding and retention, which helps students to increase vocabulary. In other words, students should increase vocabulary, but also pay more attention to the use of grammar rules. The increase in vocabulary learning during and after the implementation was remarkably noticeable. However, students were not able to change the grammar tense in various verbs. For example, present base form versus past form, which interfere in the students' oral production. The limitations were that there was not enough space versus the plenty of vocabulary that the students had to use to create the connections. The reattachment of vocabulary, laziness to perform the technique, difficulties while recalling some words, writing examples. For further research, we have some ideas. For example, this research would explore other vocabulary learning strategies which would support the mnemonic memory palace technique, such as determination, social memory, cognitive and metacognitive strategies. It would be interesting to research the relation of memory strategies in English for specific purposes to memorize long word lists from different disciplines or fields of study. It would be productive to study the students' attitude and interest to the mnemonic techniques, and if those are related to four skills improvement. Then we have the references that we use for this research that you can see. And we really appreciate your listening to our presentation. That's the end. Thank you very much.